The old man on the porch wasn't looking for trouble, but in a town like Millfield, trouble had a way of finding you. His name was William Crawford, though most folks just called him Bill. He was 62 years old, with hands like gnarled oak and eyes that had seen the world turn over more times than he cared to count. He'd built the Double C Ranch from dust and dreams, buried a wife, and lost a son to a war that felt like it happened 1,000 years ago. Now all he had left were his cattle, his memories, and a cup of lukewarm coffee that tasted like yesterday. The Wyoming wind was howling, kicking up dust and secrets down the main street. It was the kind of sound that made you feel lonely, even in a town square. And then he heard it, a different sound, cruel laughter, sharp and ugly, slicing through the wind song. It came from the alley next to Murphy's saloon. 3 men stumbled out into the fading light. Bill knew them all. Pete Donovan, a drifter with a soul as scarred as his knuckles. His brother Roy, who was half Pete's size but had twice the venom. And Bart Stevens, a local ranch hand who'd been fired from every job for being meaner than a rattlesnake in a boot. They were dragging something between them. No, not something. Someone. A boy, no older than 12. His clothes were ripped, his face a mess of dirt and blood. It was Timothy Rodriguez, the son of the woman who ran the boarding house. A good kid, a quiet kid. "Please," the boy gasped, his voice thin and reedy. "I didn't steal nothing. I was just looking." Pete Donovan didn't even slow down. He backhanded the boy, and the sound of it was like a whip crack. It echoed down the empty street. "Don't lie to us, you little greaser," Pete snarled. "We saw you pocket that candy." Roy kicked the boy's legs out from under him. Timothy hit the dirt hard. "Maybe we should teach you a lesson," Roy sneered, drawing back his boot. Bill Crawford had seen enough. He set his coffee cup down on the porch rail, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to stop time. The wood creaked as he stood up, his old joints groaning in protest. His hand, almost without thinking, fell to the Colt. 45 resting on his hip. It was a comfortable weight, an old friend. "That's enough," Bill's voice boomed across the street. It wasn't loud, but it had the weight of a coming storm. The 3 men froze. They turned, their faces a mix of surprise and annoyance. They knew Bill Crawford. Everyone did. They knew he was fair. They knew he was quiet. But they were about to learn what else he was. "This ain't your business, old man," Pete Donovan shouted, trying to sound brave. Bill stepped off the porch. His boots hit the dusty street with a soft thud. One step, then another. He walked toward them, slow and steady, his eyes locked on the 3 men. The world seemed to shrink until it was just that dusty patch of ground, a battered boy, and the 4 men who were about to decide his fate. "Anytime grown men are beating on a child," Bill said, his voice dropping low and cold, "it becomes my business." Bart Stevens, drunk on cheap whiskey and his own cruelty, let out a harsh laugh. "Your business? You're just a washed-up rancher, Crawford, nothing more." Bill ignored him. His eyes found Timothy, who was looking up from the dirt, a flicker of hope in his tear-filled eyes. "Let the boy go," Bill said. It wasn't a request. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. For a second, nobody moved. The wind howled, the sun bled across the horizon, and Pete Donovan's hand started to twitch. It was inching toward his gun. Bill saw the movement, but he wasn't looking at Pete's hand. He was looking at his eyes. He saw the flicker of doubt, the fear warring with the foolish pride. And that's when Bill knew he had them, or so he thought. In a flash, Bill's Colt was in his hand. It wasn't the frantic draw of a young man, but the smooth, practiced motion of someone who had lived with a gun as a part of his own arm. The barrel was level, pointed straight at Pete Donovan's chest, before Pete's fingers had even brushed the handle of his own pistol. "I wouldn't," Bill said, his voice flat as a tombstone. The street went dead silent. The few folks who had been watching from their windows and doorways held their breath. This wasn't a scuffle anymore. This was something else. Roy Donovan took a nervous step back. Bart Stevens looked like a cornered animal. "He stole from Murphy," Pete protested, his voice weak. "Did you see him?" Bill's eyes were like chips of ice. "Well, no, but—" "So you beat a child on a suspicion," Bill cut him off. "A child who says he's innocent." From the doorway of the general store, a woman's voice rang out. "He is innocent." It was Mrs. Henderson, her face pale but her voice strong. "I saw the whole thing from my window." The boy didn't take a thing. They grabbed him as soon as he walked out of the saloon. Then another voice joined in, this one from the saloon itself. It was Murphy, the owner, a big Irishman with a weary face. "The boy's right," he called out. "He comes in to look at the candy sometimes. Never caused a lick of trouble." Pete Donovan's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. He was cornered, humiliated. But it was Bart Stevens who snapped. With a wild yell, he lunged, not at Bill, but at Timothy. He grabbed the boy, yanking him up from the dirt and holding him like a shield. He pressed the barrel of a small, rusty derringer against the boy's temple. "Drop it, old man!" Bart screamed, his eyes wide with whiskey and rage. "Drop it, or the kid gets it." The world stopped spinning. Bill's mind raced. He had a clear shot at Bart, but the risk was unthinkable. A twitch, a flinch, and the boy was dead. He looked at Timothy, and for a heartbreaking second, he didn't see Timothy. He saw his own son, David, at that age, his face full of trust, a trust Bill had failed to honor. He wasn't going to fail this boy. Slowly, deliberately, Bill lowered his Colt. He opened his hand and let the heavy pistol fall into the dust with a soft thud. Bart Stevens grinned, a broken-toothed, triumphant sneer. "Not so tough now, are you, old man?" He shoved Timothy away. The boy stumbled and fell. Bart raised his derringer, pointing it now at Bill's chest. "You should have stayed on your damn porch," Bart snarled. But as he spoke, his eyes flickered. Just for a second. He glanced over Bill's shoulder, toward the saloon. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but Bill saw it. It was a look of confirmation, a signal, and in that split second, Bill Crawford understood. This was never about candy. The shot didn't come from Bart's gun. It exploded from the shadows of the alleyway, a deafening roar that sent birds scattering from the rooftops. Bart Stevens' eyes went wide, not in triumph, but in shocked surprise. A dark hole appeared in the center of his chest, and he crumpled to the ground without a sound. For a heartbeat, everyone was frozen. Then chaos erupted. Roy and Pete Donovan stared at their fallen friend, then at the alley, then at Bill, their faces masks of pure terror. They scrambled for their horses, not even bothering to shoot back. They just wanted out. In seconds, they were gone, two clouds of dust vanishing down the road. Bill didn't watch them go. He scooped his Colt from the dust and spun toward the alley, his eyes narrowed, searching the deep shadows. A figure stepped out, a man Bill had never seen before. He was tall and thin, dressed in a black duster, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He held a smoking rifle in his hands. "You're welcome," the stranger said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Who are you?" Bill demanded, keeping his pistol trained on the man. The stranger didn't answer. He just nodded toward the saloon. "You should ask Murphy," he said. "He's the one who sent for me." Bill's blood ran cold. Murphy? The saloon owner who had just defended Timothy? It didn't make any sense. He glanced toward the saloon. Murphy was standing in the doorway, but his face wasn't weary and kind anymore. It was hard, cold. He looked at Bart Stevens' body, then at Bill, and gave a slow, almost regretful shake of his head. "You weren't supposed to get involved, Crawford," Murphy said. "This had nothing to do with you." The stranger in the black duster took a step forward. "Stevens and the Donovans were loose ends. They knew too much. Murphy here hired me to clean things up." He gestured with his rifle toward Timothy, who was still on the ground shaking. The boy saw something he shouldn't have. They were just supposed to scare him. But Stevens, he always took things too far. It was all starting to click into place, a terrible, ugly puzzle. The beating. Murphy's convenient defense. The look that passed between Bart and the saloon. It was a setup, a public execution disguised as a brawl over candy, and Bill had walked right into the middle of it. "What did he see?" Bill asked, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger smiled, a thin, cruel slash in the shadows of his hat. "He saw us unloading a special delivery in the back, a delivery for a very important client. Behind him, two more men emerged from the alley, both holding rifles. Two more appeared in the windows of the saloon upstairs. The town square, which had felt so empty moments before, was now a kill box. And Bill and the boy were standing right in the center. The stranger raised his rifle. "Like I said, you should have stayed on your porch. Now you're a loose end too." He was going to die, here in the dirt of his own town, defending a boy he barely knew. He thought of his wife, Mary. He thought of his son, David. He had promised them he would live a good life. He never thought it would end like this. He tightened his grip on his Colt, ready to take at least one of them with him. But then Timothy spoke. His voice was small, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "I know where you hit it," he said. Every eye in the square turned to the boy. The stranger in the duster took a half step toward him. "What did you say, boy?" "The box," Timothy said, getting to his feet, his small body trembling but his voice getting stronger. "The long wooden box with the railroad markings. You hid it under the loose floorboards in the old abandoned smithy." The stranger froze. Even from 20 feet away, Bill could see the man's knuckles turn white on his rifle. He had not expected this. None of them had. The boy had just signed his own death warrant, or he had just given them their only chance to survive. For a long second, the only sound was the wind. The stranger, the man in the duster, stared at Timothy, his mind clearly racing. The boy had called his bluff. "You're a clever kid," the stranger said, his voice losing its confident edge. "Too clever." He made a decision. He nodded to the men in the saloon windows. "Take the old man. We'll take the boy. Let's go pay a visit to the old smithy." Bill knew he couldn't let them take Timothy. Whatever was in that box, it was worth more than all of their lives combined. He had to do something, now. He roared and charged, not at the stranger, but straight at Murphy, who was still standing in the saloon doorway. It was the last thing any of them expected. Bill crashed into the big Irishman like a freight train, sending them both tumbling backward into the saloon. The world exploded into a whirlwind of splintering wood, shouting, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The men in the windows fired, but their shots went wide, hitting the doorframe where Bill had been a second before. Inside the saloon, Bill slammed Murphy against the bar. "What's in the box, Murphy?" he snarled. Murphy, his face white with terror, just shook his head. "You don't understand, Crawford. These men, they're not just drifters. They work for him." "Him who?" Before Murphy could answer, one of the riflemen from upstairs was clambering down the staircase. Bill shoved Murphy into him, sending them both sprawling, and dove over the bar, taking cover behind the thick oak. A bullet splintered the wood right where his head had been. Outside, he could hear the stranger shouting orders. "Forget the old man. Get the boy." Bill peered over the top of the bar. Through the swinging doors, he saw the stranger and his other man grabbing Timothy. The boy was fighting, kicking and screaming, but he was no match for them. They were dragging him toward the old smithy at the end of the street. He was out of time. He had to make a choice. Stay here and fight 4 men in a saloon, or go after the 2 who had the boy. It wasn't a choice at all. He scanned the bar. Bottles of whiskey, beer, glasses, and at the far end a row of oil lamps, their wicks trimmed, ready for the night. He grabbed 2 of them. With a roar, he vaulted back over the bar, a lamp in each hand. The 2 men on the floor were just getting to their feet. He didn't hesitate. He threw the first lamp. It shattered against the wall behind them, showering the dry wood and curtains with oil. He threw the second one. It hit the floor, and a whoosh of flame erupted, climbing the walls in a hungry orange sheet. The saloon became an inferno. The men screamed, caught between the fire and the only exit. Bill didn't wait to watch. He burst back out through the swinging doors into the street. The stranger and his man were halfway to the smithy, dragging the still struggling Timothy with them. They looked back, their faces illuminated by the growing fire, their expressions a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You crazy old fool," the stranger screamed. "You've just burned this whole town down." Bill didn't answer. He just raised his Colt, took a steadying breath, and fired. The bullet didn't hit the stranger. It wasn't meant to. It kicked up a cloud of dust just in front of his feet, making him flinch and stop. It was the opening Timothy needed. The boy stomped down hard on the stranger's instep. The man howled in pain, his grip loosening for just a second. Timothy twisted free and ran. He didn't run toward Bill. He ran in the other direction, ducking behind the water trough in the middle of the street. Smart kid. Now it was 2 against 1. The stranger and his man raised their rifles. Bill dove behind an overturned wagon, the wood exploding with splinters as bullets slammed into it. The fire at the saloon was growing, casting a hellish red glow over the entire street. People were shouting, running with buckets of water, but it was already too big, too hot. The dry old wood of Millfield was tinder, and Bill had just lit the match. He was pinned down. He had 6 shots in his Colt, and they had rifles. The math wasn't good. He risked a quick look around the edge of the wagon. The 2 men were advancing, using the buildings for cover, moving closer. He needed a miracle, and then he got one. A second-story window of the boarding house flew open. Maria Rodriguez, Timothy's mother, appeared. Her face was grim, determined, and in her hands she held an old, heavy-looking buffalo rifle. Bill hadn't even known she owned one. She didn't waste time aiming. She just leveled the big gun and fired. The roar of it shook the street. The bullet went wide, but it slammed into the wall next to the stranger's head, showering him with splintered wood and plaster. He and his man jumped back, startled by this new threat. It was the distraction Bill needed. He burst from behind the wagon, firing as he ran. 1 shot, 2, 3. He wasn't aiming to kill. He was aiming to move them, to push them back, to get them away from the boy. His 3rd shot hit the gunman in the shoulder. The man cried out and dropped his rifle, stumbling back. The stranger dragged his wounded companion into the shadows between 2 buildings. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic shouts of the townspeople. Bill ran to the water trough, crouching beside Timothy. "You all right, son?" "Yes, sir," Timothy panted, his eyes wide as saucers. "What's in the box, Mr. Crawford? Why do they want it so bad?" "I don't know," Bill said honestly, "but we're going to find out." He peered over the trough. The street was a chaotic mess of smoke and running figures. The stranger and his wounded man were gone. They had vanished into the growing darkness. They hadn't run. Bill knew it in his gut. They had just retreated. They were regrouping, and they would be back. Mrs. Henderson ran up to them, her face smudged with soot. "Bill, the whole west side of the street is going up. We have to get everyone out." He looked at the fire. The stranger was right. He may have just doomed his own town. The flames were already leaping from the saloon to the next building. The wind was fanning them, pushing them down the street, turning a single fire into a raging wall of destruction. And somewhere in that chaos, 2 killers were hunting for a boy who knew their secret. He looked at Timothy. The boy wasn't crying. He was watching the fire, his face a mixture of fear and a strange, hard resolve. "The smithy," Timothy said. "They're still going to go for the box." "I know," Bill said. He reloaded his Colt, his hands moving with steady, practiced motions. "That's where we're going, too." He was no longer just a rancher. He was the only thing standing between these people and the monsters who had come to their town. And he had a terrible feeling that the fire he started was only the beginning of the night's horrors. The real fight was yet to come. The old smithy was at the far end of town, away from the worst of the fire, but smoke hung heavy in the air, burning their lungs and stinging their eyes. The world was lit by a flickering, apocalyptic orange. Bill moved like a ghost, keeping to the shadows, with Timothy sticking close behind him. The boy was scared, Bill could see it, but he was holding it together. He had more grit than most men Bill knew. They slipped through the smithy's broken side door. The inside was a cavern of darkness, smelling of old coal smoke and rust. Moonlight streamed through holes in the roof, illuminating a giant, silent anvil and the ghostly shapes of discarded tools. "Where is it?" Bill whispered. Timothy pointed to a corner where a stack of old barrels was piled. "Behind there, under the floor." Bill nodded. He pulled out his knife. "Stay here, stay quiet. If you hear anything, you run. You run and you don't look back. Understand?" Timothy just nodded, his eyes fixed on the door. Bill moved to the barrels. They were heavy, but he managed to roll them aside one by one. Underneath, just as Timothy had said, were 2 floorboards that looked newer than the rest. He used his knife to pry at the edges. The wood groaned in protest. He was working against time. He could hear the fire roaring behind them, a constant, hungry beast, and he could feel the presence of the other men, hunting in the dark. Finally, one of the boards came loose. He reached into the dark space beneath. His fingers brushed against cold, smooth wood. He found the edge of the box and pulled. It was heavy, long, about the size of a rifle case. He dragged it out into a patch of moonlight. It was just a plain wooden crate with the markings of the Union Pacific Railroad stenciled on the side. There was no lock, just a simple latch. His heart pounded in his chest. He was about to find out what was worth killing a boy for, what was worth burning a town over. He lifted the latch. He opened the lid. He stared. It wasn't guns, it wasn't gold. It was full of books, leather-bound ledgers, just like the kind he used for the ranch. He picked one up. On the cover, in neat gold-embossed letters, were the words, Black Creek Payroll. It made no sense. He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with columns of names and numbers, payments, dates. He flipped through, scanning the entries. Most were just names he didn't recognize. But then, one jumped out at him. Bart Stevens, $50. Pete Donovan, $50. Roy Donovan, $50. And below that, another entry. Murphy, T, $200. These were payroll ledgers for a crew of hired guns. This was their whole operation, written down in black and white. Who they were, what they did, and who paid them. He grabbed another book. This one was labeled Territorial Acquisitions. It wasn't payroll. It was a list of properties, ranches, farms, mining claims, and next to each name, a date and a single word. Henderson Ranch, fire. Miller claim, cave-in. Double C Ranch, pending. His ranch, his home, it was on the list. This wasn't just a band of killers. This was a corporate takeover, frontier style. They were systematically removing anyone who stood in the way of their employer's ambitions. And they were keeping meticulous records. And then he saw the name at the top of the page. The name of the man who owned these books. The man who was paying for all this death and destruction. The breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. Judge Alistair Cromwell, the territorial judge, the most powerful man in Wyoming, a man known for his speeches about law and order and progress, a man Bill had shaken hands with just last year. This box didn't just contain evidence of a few murders. It contained proof that the entire territory was built on a foundation of lies and blood, orchestrated by the one man everyone was supposed to trust. A floorboard creaked behind him. Bill spun around, dropping the book and raising his Colt. The stranger in the black duster stood in the doorway. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face, illuminated by the distant fire, was a mask of grim purpose. "You are a remarkably difficult man to kill, Mr. Crawford," the stranger said. "The judge was right about you. He said you'd be a problem. So he sent his dog to put me down," Bill growled. "I'm more than just a dog," the stranger said, taking a slow step into the smithy. His wounded companion was nowhere to be seen. He was alone. "I'm the man who ensures progress happens on schedule. And you, your ranch, this whole pathetic little town, you're behind schedule." "And the boy?" Bill gestured to the corner where Timothy was hidden. "Was he behind schedule too?" "The boy was a mistake," the stranger said flatly. "He saw a face he shouldn't have when we were meeting with Murphy. A loose end, just like you." He raised his rifle. "Give me the box, Crawford. The judge will be lenient. He might even let you live." Bill looked down at the crate full of ledgers. He thought of the names, the fires, the accidents. He thought of his own ranch, listed as pending. He thought of the future of this territory, built on the whims of a monster hiding behind a robe. He looked back at the stranger. "You tell the judge," he said, his voice ringing with defiance, "that the law has finally come to Millfield." He kicked the crate with his boot. It slid across the dusty floor, stopping right in the middle of the room. "Come and get it," Bill challenged. The stranger's eyes narrowed. It was a standoff, a final deadly negotiation in a burning town. But what the stranger didn't know was that this was never about the box. Not anymore. It was about the boy hiding in the shadows. And Bill had a plan. He just prayed he would live long enough to see it through. The stranger wasn't stupid. He saw the crate sitting in the open, and he knew it was a trap. He didn't move toward it. Instead, he slowly began to circle to the left, using the massive forge as cover, trying to get a better angle on Bill. Bill mirrored his movement, circling to the right, keeping the anvil between them. It was a deadly dance in the flickering firelight. "You're a brave man, Crawford," the stranger said, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. "I'll give you that. But bravery is just a fancy word for foolishness, and progress is just a fancy word for greed," Bill shot back. He needed to create a diversion, something big. His eyes darted around the smithy, landing on a long metal chain hanging from a ceiling beam, a heavy hook on the end. It was used for lifting engine blocks. It was positioned right above the center of the room, right above the crate of ledgers, and the release lever was on a pillar just a few feet to his right. He fired a shot, not at the stranger, but at a stack of old metal sheets piled against the far wall. They crashed to the ground with a deafening clang. The stranger flinched, firing his rifle instinctively toward the sound. In that split second, Bill dove for the lever. He yanked it down with all his strength. The chain and hook plummeted from the ceiling. It didn't hit the stranger, but it hit the floor with the force of a thunderclap, sending up a shower of dust and sparks. It landed right on top of the crate, smashing the wood into splinters. The ledgers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The stranger stared at the ruined box. His plan to retrieve it intact now literally shattered. He let out a roar of pure fury and charged from behind the forge, firing his rifle wildly. Bill rolled behind the anvil, bullets sparking off the ancient metal. He was out in the open now. He had one last, desperate idea. "Timothy!" he yelled. "The bellows! Now!" In the corner, Timothy, who had been frozen in terror, sprang into action. He scrambled to the giant leather bellows connected to the forge's fire pit. It was a massive, accordion-like device, used to blast air into the coal bed. The boy threw his whole weight onto the long wooden handle, again and again. The bellows wheezed like a dying giant, and with each pump, a thick cloud of ancient soot and coal dust billowed out from the cold fire pit, filling the air. The stranger stopped, coughing, blinded by the sudden, choking black cloud. It was the opening Bill needed. He burst through the cloud of soot, a 62-year-old ghost made of fury and vengeance. He didn't fire his gun. This was too personal for that. He crashed into the stranger, driving his shoulder into the man's chest. The rifle flew from the stranger's grasp, clattering away into the darkness. They both hit the floor hard, a tangle of limbs and grunts and fists. Bill was old, but he was ranch strong. He had spent a lifetime wrestling steers and hauling hay. The stranger was younger, faster, but he was wiry. He squirmed out from under Bill, landing a sharp punch to Bill's ribs that stole his breath. Bill staggered back, gasping. The stranger scrambled for his rifle. He wasn't going to make it. From the darkness, a small figure shot past Bill. It was Timothy. He didn't have a weapon. He just had desperation. He grabbed one of the scattered ledgers from the floor and swung it with all his might, hitting the stranger square in the side of the head. The man grunted, stunned for a second, shaking his head to clear it. But that second was all Bill needed. He lunged forward and kicked the rifle, sending it skittering across the floor. He grabbed a heavy blacksmith's hammer from a workbench. He turned to face the stranger, the hammer held high. The stranger looked from the hammer to Bill's face, and for the first time, Bill saw real fear in his eyes. The professional killer, the enforcer for the most powerful man in the territory, was afraid of an old rancher with a hammer. "It's over," Bill panted, his chest heaving. The stranger slowly raised his hands. "All right, Crawford," he said, his voice strained. "You win. You win." But his eyes weren't looking at Bill. They were looking just past him, at the doorway. Bill heard the click of a hammer being cocked behind him. He had forgotten about the other one, the wounded gunman. He started to turn, but he knew he was too late. He had won the fight, but he was about to lose the war. He closed his eyes, a single bitter thought flashing through his mind. I failed. A shot rang out. But it wasn't the thunderous blast of a rifle. It was a smaller, sharper crack. Bill opened his eyes. The wounded gunman was standing in the doorway, his rifle half raised. But his eyes were wide with surprise, and he was staring down at his own chest. A small, dark hole was leaking blood onto his shirt. He collapsed forward, revealing the person standing behind him. It was Pete Donovan, the drifter, the bully from the alley. He held a smoking pistol in his hand, his face pale and sweating in the firelight. "My brother, Roy," Pete stammered, looking at Bill. "Bart shot him, just like this man's boss was going to do to us. We were just loose ends." He looked at the stranger, who was staring at him in utter disbelief. "I ain't much, Crawford," Pete said, his voice shaking, "but I ain't a man who lets his brother's death go unanswered." The stranger saw his chance. With Bill and Pete distracted, he dove for his fallen rifle. But Pete was faster. He turned and fired his pistol again. The shot hit the stranger in the leg. He screamed and went down, clutching his shattered knee. Silence fell in the smithy. The fire still raged outside, but in here, the battle was over. Bill looked from the bleeding stranger to the trembling bully who had just saved his life. He looked at Timothy, who was standing there, covered in soot, holding a ledger like a shield. He had been wrong. The law hadn't come to Millfield. Something much messier, much more complicated, and much more human had. They stumbled out of the smithy into a scene from a nightmare. Half of Main Street was gone, consumed by a roaring inferno that lit up the night sky. The heat was immense, and the air was thick with smoke and the sound of collapsing buildings. The townspeople had formed a bucket brigade from the main well, a desperate, futile effort against the blaze. Doc Patterson saw them first and ran over, his face black with soot. "Bill, my God, are you all right?" Bill just nodded, too exhausted to speak. He looked down at the stranger, whose leg was bleeding profusely into the dirt. "Get your bag, Doc. This one needs patching up. The other one, he's past helping." As the doc tended to the wounded gunman, Sheriff Morrison rode into town, flanked by two deputies. He'd clearly seen the glow from miles away and ridden hard. He took in the scene, the fire, the bodies, Bill holding a gun, and a notorious drifter standing beside him, and his face hardened. "Crawford, what in the hell happened here?" Bill was about to speak, but Timothy stepped forward. The boy, still covered in soot and grime, held up the ledger he was carrying. "It was Judge Cromwell, Sheriff," Timothy said, his voice clear and steady, ringing with an authority that defied his age. It was all him. For the next hour, as the townspeople finally managed to contain the fire's spread, Bill and Timothy laid out the whole story for the sheriff. They showed him the ledgers, the names, the pending doom for the Double C Ranch. Pete Donovan surprisingly stayed, and his testimony confirmed everything. He told them how Judge Cromwell's man, the stranger whose name was Cole, had hired them for intimidation jobs, and how Bart Stevens was a favorite of Cole's for the dirtier work. Sheriff Morrison, a good and honest man, listened to it all, his face growing darker with every word. He looked at the ledgers, then at the smoldering ruins of his town, and finally at the powerful name at the heart of it all. He knew what this meant. He wasn't just arresting a few hired guns. He was declaring war on the most powerful man in the territory. "I'll need to take these into evidence," the sheriff said, his voice heavy as he collected the scattered ledgers. "And I'll need your testimony, all of you." He looked at Pete. "Including you, Donovan. You cooperate, and I'll speak to the circuit judge on your behalf." Pete just nodded, looking like a man who had finally run out of road. They locked Cole, the stranger, in the town's only jail cell, his leg bandaged up by the doc. As they led him away, he looked at Bill, his eyes burning with a cold, professional hatred. "You think this is over?" Cole sneered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. The judge owns this territory. He owns the governor, he owns the railroad, he owns the law. He'll be out of this jail in a week, and then he will wipe this entire town off the map. He'll salt the earth where your home stood." A chill went through the crowd. They knew he was probably right. They had won the battle, but the war was just beginning, and their enemy was a king. But Bill Crawford just looked back at him, his face calm. "Maybe," he said, "but tonight you're in our jail. And these people," he gestured to the soot-stained faces of his neighbors, "are still standing. That's a start." As the sun began to rise, casting a sickly pale light on the devastated town, A strange sense of quiet settled over the survivors. They had lost homes, businesses, their sense of safety. But they had also found something else. Maria Rodriguez came and wrapped her son in a fierce hug, tears streaming down her face, leaving clean tracks in the soot. Mrs. Henderson started organizing coffee and food for everyone. Even Murphy, the saloon owner, who had lost everything in the fire he helped start, was seen quietly helping clear debris, his face a mask of shame and regret. Bill stood on the porch of the general store, one of the few buildings untouched by the fire, and watched his town, his people. They were beaten, exhausted, and facing a terrifying future. But they were together. Timothy came and stood beside him. The boy looked up at the old rancher, his eyes full of a respect that went deeper than words. "What happens now, Mr. Crawford?" he asked. Bill put a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked at the smoking ruins, then at the hopeful faces of his friends, and then at the endless Wyoming sky. "Now, son," he said, a weary but determined smile touching his lips. "Now we rebuild, and we get ready for the judge's next move, because this fight is far from over." He knew Cole's threat wasn't an empty one. A man like Judge Cromwell wouldn't take this lying down. He had money, power, and an army of men just like Cole. All Millfield had was a handful of ledgers, a weary sheriff, and a town full of ranchers and shopkeepers. The odds were impossible, but as Bill looked at the rising sun, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Not since before the war, before he lost his wife. He felt hope, and he knew deep in his bones that he would see this through to the end, no matter what it cost him. 1 year later, the sun shone down on a new Millfield. The scars of the fire were still there, like faint wrinkles on an old man's face. But new buildings stood where the old ones had burned. The saloon had been rebuilt, now owned by Mrs. Henderson, who ran it as a respectable town hall and eatery. The sound of hammers and saws was the town's new anthem. Timothy Rodriguez, now 13, stood in the town cemetery. He wasn't a boy anymore. The last year had forged him into something new. He stood before a simple wooden cross, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base. The cross read, "William Bill Crawford." He stood for others. "Morning, Mr. Crawford," Timothy said softly. "I know you'd want an update." He took a deep breath. "Well, we did it. Your sacrifice. It wasn't for nothing." He told the silent grave everything, how Judge Cromwell had tried to crush them, just as Cole had promised, how he'd sent lawyers and hired thugs, how he'd used his political power to try and discredit Sheriff Morrison and bury the ledgers. But the judge had underestimated Millfield. He'd underestimated the power of a story. News of the siege of Millfield spread like wildfire. Newspapers back east picked it up. A town of ordinary people standing up to a corrupt tyrant. It was the kind of story people loved. The pressure mounted. The territorial governor, implicated in the ledgers, was forced to launch a federal investigation. The trial lasted 2 months, Timothy continued, a proud smile on his face. "I had to testify. I was scared, but I just remembered what you told me, about how some things are worth fighting for. I looked right at the judge and told them everything I saw. Judge Alistair Cromwell was found guilty. His empire of blood and greed crumbled to dust. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison, all because one old man decided to step off his porch. Your ranch, my ranch now, is doing well," Timothy said, his voice catching. Bill had left the double C to Timothy and his mother in his will. "I'm learning. We're rebuilding your herd. Mama's happy. Her cough is all gone." He paused, looking out over the rolling hills that Bill had loved so much. "The thing is, Mr. Crawford," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "you didn't just save me, or the town. You saved everyone. The ledgers had names of ranchers and homesteaders all over the territory, people who would have been next. You saved them all, and they'll never even know your name." Timothy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was the only one that existed of Bill, taken years ago. He looked strong, vital, his eyes full of life. "They talk about you in the papers. They call you a hero, but they don't get it," Timothy said, tracing the outline of Bill's face with his finger. "You weren't trying to be a hero. You were just being a man, the kind of man you taught me to be." He stood there for a long time, the Wyoming wind whispering through the grass, feeling the weight of the legacy that had been passed to him. It was a heavy weight, but he was strong enough to carry it. He would run the ranch. He would help his neighbors. He would make sure the story of Bill Crawford was never forgotten. He would stand for others. The world is full of bullies and monsters, of men who hide their greed behind fancy words like progress. But every now and then, an ordinary person decides they've seen enough. They step off their porch. They make a stand. And in doing so, they change the world. What would you have done if you were Bill Crawford? Would you have stayed on the porch? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about the forgotten heroes who face down the darkness, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. You won't want to miss the stories we have coming.